close to $4 billion.
I will fly again, but I wouldn't want to do it right now, no.
It'll be very unlikely that we'll end this year beyond the early 70s in terms of occupancy, and that may even be optimistic.
What's in store for the international tourism industry? Business coverage continuing throughout the day on CNN.
Is trying to find vital information taking too much of your time? With CNN email services, you'll receive the world's most important headlines every morning and breaking news as it happens. Register free at the European edition of CNN.com and be the first to know.
What impact will current world events have on oil prices, and what is being done by OPEC?
They have to take on board what has happened since September. We are in a very, I would say, we're in a new world with economic consequences which we don't know of yet.
They're taking a look at an economic slowdown. They're saying we need to reprice oil.
The price has dropped, but it dropped because of the speculations.
The state of the oil market, part of business coverage continuing throughout the day on CNN.
This week on CNN's Inside Europe, doing battle over words and pictures. Government and media clash over reporting the war against terror. As anthrax fears sweep Europe, we look at the unanswered questions surrounding Moscow's old stockpile of bioweapons. And why British police are so upset about a film called Injustice. That's Inside Europe, only on CNN.
Welcome back to International Correspondence. A bioterrorism scare is gripping the United States. From Florida to New York to the nation's capital, anthrax fears are increasing the jitters of a grieving population. Scenes like this didn't help matters. Investigators wearing hazardous materials suits carting off bags of evidence. At first it appeared the media was a target after a man working at a tabloid news company in Florida died of anthrax. And letters addressed to TV news anchormen, including Tom Brokaw, have exposed their assistance to the bacterium. But now fear has spread to Capitol Hill. Authorities say a suspicious letter sent to the Senate Majority Leader's office contained anthrax. And the U.S. Congress was forced to close this week for tests after dozens of Senate employees tested positive for exposure. For a closer look at how the media are covering the anthrax scare and the war, we're joined now by Warren Hogue, the London Bureau Chief of the New York Times, and Bob Haggerty, the London Bureau Chief of the Wall Street Journal Europe. Gentlemen, thank you both. Bob, if I can begin with you, are we creating a panic?
I think we have to be careful not to do that. We have to draw a balance between telling the readers what they need to know, how to protect themselves, without exaggerating the risks, and without giving too many how-to hints to terrorists or pranksters.
What, putting ideas in people's heads?
Right, I think describing in too much detail how you might do a more effective attack.
Do you think, Warren, that there's been too much coverage of this? Are we telling people too much, or do you think it's basically performing a public service and telling people what they want to know?
I don't think we've been covering it too much, Sheila. I tend to philosophically think the more information you get out, the more calming it is, not the more alarming it is.
But we've seen in the last week, we've seen runs on ciprofloxacin, the drug of choice to combat anthrax. We're having to tell people, you know, if you haven't got anthrax, don't take the drug, because clearly some people are worried enough about it, that's what they're doing.
But I don't think that's something that we can control. The reaction that people have to the news they're hearing is going to be their responsibility, their actions, and I think it would be almost dangerous if the press begins to take on the responsibility for somehow controlling the actions of our readers and our viewers.
Do you think, Bob, that it makes a difference that it seems that in this instance the media were quite deliberately targets?
I think it makes them more nervous. On the other hand, I think most of them are so busy right now that they don't have much time to think about it, and they're mostly just going on with their jobs.
What do you think?
Well, as you know, I was late today for this interview because we had an envelope this morning opened in the office of the New York Times in London, and out came talcum powder. It turns out it was talcum powder. That's what the police decided after they'd answered it. I don't really think it's affected the behavior of anybody in the London Bureau, but maybe now that this has happened, it will. As far as New York, our email queues are filled with advisories from editors telling us what to do if something happens. But the reports that came out of the New York Times office when we had the attack there was really of rather wonderfully calm behavior.
Do you think the rules of engagement are different for the media this time around?
I think they are, because what we've developed since Vietnam is a tradition in the American press, at least, of being extremely critical of America at war, questioning tactics and objectives and behavior. Now suddenly it's harder to do that when so much patriotism is involved, when America itself and things we believe in, things we practice, a free press, seem to be part of the target.
But that's a good, I mean, that's a good question. Is patriotism appropriate as journalists?
I would have said no before September 11th. I don't know what I'd say now. I know my own feelings have changed. I hope it hasn't affected the way I cover the story.
Bob?
I think the press will become more critical over time. I think right now people are so stunned that they may not be asking all of the tough questions that they should, but I'm sure that those tough questions are going to come out.
In terms of the tough questions that aren't being asked, and one of the things that we haven't talked about, that we really haven't heard anyone say, is when this war ends, what does victory look like? Is it appropriate that we're covering a conflict that we have not yet been able to ask that question?
I think it's understandable that nobody can say exactly how this will play out. I think it's appropriate for us to ask officials to define the objectives as best they can.
I think you're dealing now with abstracts, a war on terrorism, and I think that abstraction will continue into the declaration of what victory is going to be. I think leaders have been pretty responsible in telling the public, look, this is different than anything that's ever happened before. It could take years. We're not really going to know when we've won. There will be no surrender statement on the deck of an aircraft carrier, that kind of thing.
And a lot of years for all of us in the field. Warren, Bob, thank you very much for joining me. Anthrax and Afghanistan had deflected some attention away from the conflict in the Middle East, but the region soon found a route back into the headlines through the twin tracks of death and diplomacy. Media response, when we come back.
Jay gets good grades, does everything right, except one little thing. At lunchtime, every now and then he likes to buy a Powerade drink. And at $1.50 a pop, Mom and Dad would rather he drink it at home and save a little money. So one day, his mom logs onto the internet and Jay gets caught. Proof of purchase right there on the screen. Minor offense, but this demonstrates a powerful tool. Software called Skyward. Purchased by schools, free to parents. Lets them keep an internet eye on their kids at school. For example, once attendance is taken and is entered by the teacher, Sandy Schultz can log on and see Jay's in class. Grades work the same way.
As soon as the report cards are posted, we can find out what the grades were before the kids even know.
It's time that we know about other religions and cultures. It's time our legal and legitimate institutions do their duties with honesty and impartiality, so that in future no terrorist can claim that what he is doing is for the rights of the people, which should have been done by the legal and legitimate institutions. It's time we ask our elected leaders some serious questions regarding the future of the common world, which belong to poor nations as much as to rich nations. It's time for global peace. A real global peace for all, irrespective of color, language, religion, and above all, social status.
The global airline industry is facing the biggest crisis of its history.
Discretionary travel is undoubtedly going to see a downturn.
If it's a reality that there is an unfair competition from the U.S. airlines, we shall act.
The best response for the airline industry now is to lower the fares, let's keep people flying, let's keep the economy moving.
The future of the airline industry, part of business coverage continuing throughout the day on CNN.
peace process has been thrown into further turmoil this week with the shooting to death of an Israeli cabinet minister. Rehavim Ze'evi was gunned down at close range outside his hotel room in Jerusalem. A Palestinian group has claimed responsibility for the attack. But earlier this week, diplomacy was the order of the day. Palestinian Authority President Yasser Arafat met with British Prime Minister Tony Blair in London. Mr. Blair says the world must seize the moment and both sides must end their violence. Now for more on the situation in the Middle East and how the war against terror is playing out in the region, we're joined from Jerusalem by Hemi Shalev, political commentator for the daily Israeli newspaper Ma'ariv, and Baria Alamuddin, foreign editor for Al Hayat, a daily Arabic newspaper. Let me begin by asking you, Hemi, what is the view in Jerusalem today? It's pretty dire by all accounts.
Yes, well, it seems that we're in the process of escalation, which started with the assassination of Minister Ze'evi. All political contacts and security contacts between the two sides have been called off, and Israel has been carrying out several operations in several areas, including entry into Palestinian-controlled areas in the towns of Beit Jala and Beit Lechem. So overall, although at the beginning of the week there was some hope that perhaps things were changing for the better, I think now we're headed for a turn for the worse, and that is the general mood.
Where do you think things go?
It's very hard to tell. There's some people who believe that we're on the verge of war, in fact. The Israeli government, following the assassination of Minister Ze'evi, issued an ultimatum to Yasser Arafat to hand over Ze'evi's assassins and to outlaw several organizations. Both demands apparently cannot be met by Arafat. He cannot hand over people who assassinated Ze'evi. We don't really know how the Israeli government will react, but in any case, its mood and its willingness to enter into a diplomatic process has decreased dramatically in the wake of the assassination.
Baria, let me ask you, how do you think that the events in Israel this week have played out in the region, which is already concerned with what's called the war on terror?
Well, you see, it's the whole mood is of terrorism anyway in the whole area, be it coming from the Israeli side or coming from Osama bin Laden, or it is all terrorism at the end of the day. What needs to be done to address all this, I think, is to look at the basic things. We say to the Israelis, come on, let's sit down, talk together, live together, solve our problems in peace, not by shooting each other. You see, a minister is a human being, just like the 10-year-old girl or like the other people who are dying every single day. Simply because he's a minister, and he actually is one of the ministers that is known for his fanatism, I condemn any killing, a minister or in New York or a 10-year-old girl. It's all killing. They're all human beings at the end of the day.
Hemi, let me ask you, in terms of what you were writing in your column in Ma'ariv, in terms of what you were seeing elsewhere in the Israeli press, is there a view now, do you think, that the time has come to end contact with Mr. Arafat, to forget about trying to move forward this way?
Well, I wouldn't say that that is the overall mood. I think opinions in Israel, as they always are divided. The polls that were carried out this week, even in the wake of the assassination, showed the Israeli public more or less split down the middle, with half advocating an all-out war against Arafat and the other half advocating an acceleration of the peace process. I would say, however, that the country was genuinely shocked by the assassination of Ze'evi, not so much because of his personality and not so much because he is a minister, but rather this was seen as an affront and something which damaged Israel's democratic institutions, its very sovereignty. The question was not here whether a minister's life is worth more or less than a 10-year-old girl's. Obviously, one cannot quantify such things. The problem was that this was a strike at the heart of the Israeli establishment, and Israelis reacted accordingly.
Baria, let me ask you one last question. Any reason, any mood for optimism?
I think there should always be reason for optimism. And if I may say something to my friend over there, I think it is not, as he said, if it's a minister or not. And it's not always that the people of Palestine have to be on the receiving end of whoever